Welcome back to another episode of True Crime Untold Cases. I'm your host, Harper Quinn. Today, we're traveling to the small farming town of Skidmore, Missouri, where in 1981, the most notorious bully in the state's history met a violent end in broad daylight. Ken Rex McElroy had terrorized this community for decades, racking up 21 indictments but never serving time, thanks to his masterful intimidation of witnesses. But on one summer morning, with dozens of townspeople present, someone decided enough was enough. Even more remarkable? In the 40 years since those fatal shots rang out, not a single person has broken their silence about who pulled the trigger. Let's dive into the extraordinary tale of the town that kept a killer's secret. In the small farming town of Skidmore, Missouri, July 10, 1981, began like any other summer day. The air was thick with humidity, and the morning sun cast long shadows across the town's modest main street. But this particular Friday would forever change the fabric of this tight-knit community of 440 people, marking a dark chapter in American justice that remains unresolved to this day. Ken Rex McElroy had been the town bully for decades, a title that barely scratched the surface of his reign of terror. Standing 6 feet tall and weighing over 270 pounds, McElroy cut an intimidating figure in his signature overalls and dark glasses. His mere presence was enough to make townspeople cross the street or hurry into the nearest building. But it wasn't just his imposing physical presence that struck fear into the hearts of Skidmore's residents. It was his well-earned reputation for violence, intimidation, and a seeming immunity to the law. By 1981, McElroy had been indicted 21 times for various serious crimes, yet had never been convicted. His list of alleged offenses was both lengthy and disturbing: assault, child molestation, statutory rape, arson, hog and cattle rustling, and burglary. He had shot at least 2 men, one of whom was shot in the stomach for merely honking at McElroy when he was blocking a street with his truck. The victim survived but refused to testify, like so many others before him. McElroy's method of avoiding conviction was as simple as it was effective. He would intimidate witnesses, threaten their families, and sit menacingly in his pickup truck outside their homes at night, often accompanied by his rifle and his younger wife, Trina. Time and again, witnesses would suddenly develop memory problems on the witness stand or simply refuse to testify altogether. Local law enforcement seemed powerless to stop him, and some speculated that they were simply too afraid to try. The story of Ken Rex McElroy began long before that fateful July morning. Born in 1934, he was the 15th of 16 children, raised in a ramshackle house between Skidmore and Clearmont. His father was a sharecropper, and young Ken Rex learned early on to take what he wanted. By his teens, he had already developed a reputation for theft and violence. He dropped out of school in the 8th grade, barely able to read or write, but highly skilled in the art of intimidation. McElroy's personal life was as controversial as his criminal activities. He had married 3 times officially, though he had relationships with many more women, several of whom were underage when he began dating them. His last wife, Trina McLeod, was just 14 when he began grooming her. When her parents tried to stop the relationship, McElroy burned their house down and shot their dog. He then proceeded to statutorily rape their daughter until she became pregnant at age 14. To avoid statutory rape charges, he divorced his 3rd wife and married Trina. By the time of his death, he had fathered more than 10 children with different women. The incident that would ultimately lead to McElroy's demise began with something seemingly trivial: candy stolen from the local grocery store. In 1980, one of McElroy's children was accused of taking candy from Ernest Bowenkamp's store. When Trainer McElroy went to the store to confront Bowenkamp about the accusation, an argument ensued. McElroy, true to form, took matters into his own hands. One night, he parked outside the store and waited for Bowenkamp to emerge. When the 70-year-old shopkeeper stepped out to the store's loading dock, McElroy shot him with a shotgun. Bowenkamp survived, and this time, thanks to his testimony and other witnesses, McElroy was finally convicted of assault. However, McElroy's attorney managed to appeal the conviction, and McElroy was released on bond pending a new trial. Upon his release, McElroy's behavior became even more brazen. He appeared at local bars brandishing rifles and shotguns, threatening to kill Bowenkamp and anyone else who had testified against him. He would park outside witnesses' homes, sometimes sitting there all night, rifle visible on his truck's gun rack. The terror in Skidmore reached a fever pitch. The townspeople, desperate for help, appealed to law enforcement at every level: local police, county sheriff, state troopers, even the FBI. But the response was always the same. Without witnesses willing to testify, there was little they could do. The legal system that was supposed to protect them had failed completely, and the residents of Skidmore found themselves trapped in a nightmare with seemingly no end in sight. On July 9, 1981, McElroy was once again in court, this time for a hearing related to the Bowenkamp shooting. His attorney won yet another delay in the trial. As McElroy left the courthouse, he was heard bragging that he would get Bowenkamp before any trial could take place. That evening, he made his usual rounds of the local bars, showing off his rifle and making threats. The town of Skidmore had reached its breaking point, though no one could have predicted exactly what would unfold the next morning. The events of July 10th began with an emergency town meeting at the American Legion Hall. Nearly 60 townspeople gathered to discuss what could be done about Rex McElroy. The town's minister, the mayor, and even the sheriff attended, though accounts differ as to exactly what was said during this meeting. What is known is that while the meeting was still in progress, someone spotted McElroy's pickup truck parked outside the D&G Tavern across the street. The meeting quickly broke up, and people began to filter out onto the street. McElroy and Trina had just finished their morning coffee and were getting into their pickup truck. What happened next would become one of the most fascinating and controversial moments in American criminal justice history. McElroy settled into the driver's seat of his Chevrolet Silverado, while Trina took her place beside him. The morning sun glinted off the rifle in the truck's rear window rack, a sight that had terrorized the townspeople for so many years. But on this morning, something was different. Instead of scurrying away in fear, the townspeople began to gather around the truck. Witnesses would later recall that the atmosphere was charged with an unusual tension. Somewhere between 30 and 45 people stood in the street, forming a loose semicircle around McElroy's vehicle. Some would later describe it as eerily quiet, while others remembered a low murmur of voices. McElroy, perhaps sensing the shift in dynamics, attempted to start his truck. Then, in a moment that would forever change Skidmore, multiple shots rang out. According to Trina's later testimony, she heard 2 distinct clusters of gunfire. The first shots came from behind the truck, followed immediately by shots from the passenger side. At least 2 different weapons were used. Investigators would later determine that both .22 caliber and .357 Magnum bullets struck McElroy. The bullets shattered the truck's windows and struck McElroy in the head and neck. Trina, who was not hit, screamed and ducked down in the cab. When she looked up, her husband was slumped over the steering wheel, blood streaming from his wounds. Rex McElroy, the man who had terrorized Skidmore for decades, was dead at the age of 47. In the immediate aftermath of the shooting, witnesses described an almost surreal scene. No one ran, no one panicked. The crowd simply dispersed, walking away in different directions as if nothing extraordinary had happened. By the time law enforcement arrived, the street was nearly empty, save for McElroy's truck and his hysterical widow. Del Clement, owner of the D&G Tavern, would later be identified by Traynor as one of the shooters, though he vehemently denied any involvement until his death in 2009. Traynor claimed she saw him holding a rifle immediately after the shooting, but her testimony alone was not enough to bring charges. In fact, despite the presence of dozens of witnesses, no one else would come forward to identify the shooters. The investigation that followed was unlike anything in American criminal justice history. When state highway patrol officers and county deputies arrived to investigate, they found themselves faced with an unprecedented wall of silence. Interviews with townspeople yielded nothing but variations of, "I didn't see anything," or "I was looking the other way when it happened." Even more remarkable was the consistency of the townspeople's silence. No one broke ranks, no one came forward with information, even when a federal investigation was launched and a grand jury was convened. The grand jury interviewed over 100 people, but could not gather enough evidence to issue any indictments. The code of silence extended beyond just the immediate witnesses. In the months and years that followed, no one in Skidmore ever leaked information about the identities of the shooters, even in private conversations. It was as if the entire town had made an unspoken pact to take this secret to their graves. The killing of Rex McElroy became national news, drawing journalists from across the country to the small Missouri town. The story captured the public's imagination, a real-life instance of frontier justice in modern America. The case was featured on CBS's 60 Minutes and inspired numerous books, including In Broad Daylight by Harry McLean, which became a bestseller and was later made into a television movie. The national media coverage painted conflicting portraits of the event. Some portrayed it as a community taking justice into their own hands when the legal system had failed them, while others saw it as an alarming example of mob violence. The term vigilante justice was frequently used, though many Skidmore residents rejected this characterization. Traynor McElroy filed a wrongful death lawsuit against the town of Skidmore, the county, and several individuals, including Del Clement. The suit was eventually settled out of court for a small sum. She left Skidmore shortly after the shooting and later remarried. In interviews years later, she maintained that she knew who killed her husband, but understood why no one would come forward. The impact on Skidmore was profound and lasting. While many residents felt relieved to be free of McElroy's reign of terror, the town's reputation was forever changed. Skidmore became known as the town that got away with murder, a label that many residents resented but couldn't shake. The silence surrounding the case has remained unbroken for over 4 decades. As the years passed, many of those present that day have died, taking their knowledge of the events to their graves. Those who remain continue to maintain their silence, even as the statute of limitations on most related crimes has long since expired. The case has become a fascinating study in group psychology and rural justice. How could so many people maintain such complete silence for so long? The answer seems to lie in the unique dynamics of small-town life and the shared trauma of McElroy's decades-long reign of terror. The townspeople didn't see themselves as protecting killers. They saw themselves as protecting their community. Law enforcement officials who worked the case have expressed both frustration and a degree of understanding about the town's silence. David Baird, who was the county prosecutor at the time, later stated, "The only way we could have brought charges was if we had witnesses willing to testify, and there simply weren't any." The morning of July 10, 1981, had lasted less than an hour, but its implications would echo through American legal history. The killing of Rex McElroy remains one of the most extraordinary examples of collective silence in the face of a serious crime in American history. The case of Rex McElroy has become a touchstone for discussions about the limits of legal justice and the complex moral questions surrounding vigilante action. In the years following the shooting, numerous legal scholars and criminologists have studied the case, attempting to understand its broader implications for the American justice system. One of the most striking aspects of the case was the complete transformation of power dynamics in Skidmore. For decades, McElroy had maintained control through fear and intimidation. But in his final moments, he found himself powerless against the very people he had terrorized. The irony wasn't lost on investigators. McElroy had maintained his grip on the town through enforced silence, and ultimately, it was silence that sealed his fate. Harry McLean, who spent 3 years researching the case for his book In Broad Daylight, discovered layers of complexity that went beyond the simple narrative of vigilante justice. In interviews with townspeople, he found that many struggled with the moral implications of their silence, even as they remained steadfast in maintaining it. As one resident told him, "Sometimes you have to do wrong to do right." The investigation itself became a case study in the limitations of traditional law enforcement methods. Despite having dozens of potential witnesses, state and federal investigators found themselves stymied at every turn. Even modern forensic techniques proved of limited use. While investigators could determine the caliber of weapons used and the approximate positions of the shooters, this information was worthless without cooperative witnesses. The FBI's involvement in the case brought additional resources and investigative techniques, but even they couldn't crack the wall of silence. Agents attempted to use psychological pressure, suggesting that someone else had already talked, but the townspeople remained unmoved. As one FBI agent later remarked, "It was like trying to break into a bank vault with a feather duster." The impact on McElroy's family was significant and long-lasting. His children, many of whom were quite young at the time of his death, grew up in the shadow of their father's reputation and violent end. Some of them later spoke about the complicated legacy they inherited, acknowledging their father's crimes while still grappling with the manner of his death and the community's response. Trainer McElroy's life took several dramatic turns after leaving Skidmore. In interviews years later, she revealed the psychological toll of witnessing her husband's murder and the subsequent isolation she experienced. While she maintained that she knew the identities of the shooters, she expressed understanding for the town's collective silence, saying, "They did what they felt they had to do. I don't agree with it, but I understand it." The case has had lasting effects on law enforcement practices and legal scholarship. It's frequently cited in discussions about the limitations of traditional law enforcement in small, close-knit communities, and the potential consequences when the legal system fails to protect citizens from persistent threats. Some legal scholars have argued that the McElroy case represents a failure of the American justice system, while others see it as evidence that community justice, while problematic, sometimes serves as a last resort when traditional legal remedies prove inadequate. The town of Skidmore itself has never fully recovered from the notoriety brought by the McElroy case. In the decades following the shooting, the population has steadily declined, and the town has faced economic challenges. Some residents believe the town's association with the McElroy case has deterred new businesses and residents from settling there. Yet, even as Skidmore has changed, the solidarity around the events of July 10, 1981, has remained unchanged. When journalists or investigators return to the town on anniversaries of the shooting, they find the same wall of silence that frustrated investigators 4 decades ago. As one resident put it, "Some secrets are meant to stay buried." The case has also sparked ongoing debates about the nature of justice and community responsibility. When does a community's right to protect itself supersede the established legal system? What happens when traditional justice mechanisms fail completely? These questions remain relevant today, particularly in discussions about community policing and justice reform. In recent years, several key figures in the case have passed away, including Del Clement, who died in 2009 maintaining his innocence to the end. With each passing year, the likelihood of ever knowing the full truth about what happened that July morning grows dimmer. Yet the case continues to fascinate, not just for its unsolved nature, but for what it reveals about human nature and community dynamics under extreme pressure. The story of Ken Rex McElroy and the town of Skidmore has become more than just a true crime narrative. It's a complex meditation on justice, community, and the limits of law. It raises uncomfortable questions about when, if ever, vigilante justice can be justified, and what happens when a community decides that protecting itself is more important than cooperating with legal authorities. The legacy of the McElroy case has had ripple effects throughout the American legal system. Law enforcement agencies have used it as a case study in how not to handle persistent offenders who terrorize small communities. The failure to protect Skidmore's citizens from McElroy's reign of terror, despite numerous arrests and indictments, highlighted serious flaws in the judicial system's handling of witness intimidation. Several states have since strengthened their witness protection programs and implemented harsher penalties for witness intimidation, citing the McElroy case as an example of what can happen when witnesses feel completely unprotected by the law. Legal scholars have pointed out that if better witness protection had been available in the 1970s and early 1980s, the tragedy might have been avoided entirely. The case has also become a valuable teaching tool in law schools and criminal justice programs. Professor Gilbert Geis, a renowned criminologist, used the McElroy case to illustrate what he called community cohesion in the face of systematic failure. He argued that the town's response, while illegal, demonstrated an almost unprecedented level of social solidarity that deserved serious academic study. The psychological impact on the townspeople who witnessed the shooting has been profound and long-lasting. Dr. James Patterson, a psychologist who interviewed several Skidmore residents in the 1990s, noted that many showed signs of post-traumatic stress disorder, not just from McElroy's years of terrorism, but from the shooting itself and the burden of maintaining their silence. One resident, speaking anonymously to a journalist in 2001, said, "It's like we're all carrying this weight together. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, thinking about that morning, but then I remember why it happened, what he did to us, and I go back to sleep." This sentiment was echoed by many others who saw the killing not as a murder, but as an act of community self-defense. The role of law enforcement in the case remains controversial. Some critics have suggested that local law enforcement's inability or unwillingness to deal with McElroy effectively made the vigilante action inevitable. Others have pointed out that the sheriff's presence at the town meeting just before the shooting raised questions about possible official complicity. David Baird, the former county prosecutor, reflected years later, "In my entire career, I've never seen anything like it. You have to understand, this wasn't a case of people not wanting to talk. They had made a conscious decision that silence was their duty to the community. How do you prosecute a case when an entire town has essentially become a conspiracy of silence?" The case has also become a touchstone for discussions about rural justice and the urban-rural divide in America. Many urban commentators saw the case as evidence of backward vigilante justice, while rural Americans often viewed it as a community protecting itself when all other options had failed. This disconnect in perspectives highlights the often vast gulf between urban and rural experiences of law and justice in America. The story has inspired numerous cultural works beyond Harry McLean's definitive book. Multiple documentaries have attempted to unravel the mystery, and the case has been featured in countless true crime series. Each new treatment brings fresh attention to Skidmore, much to the frustration of current residents who wish to move beyond their town's notorious past. Perhaps most significantly, the case has become a symbol of the complex relationship between justice and community. As one legal scholar noted, the McElroy case forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of justice itself. When the system designed to protect citizens fails completely, what options remain? The people of Skidmore answered that question in their own way, and they've lived with that answer for over 40 years. The town's silence continues to protect those involved in McElroy's death, but it has also preserved something else, a powerful reminder that justice and law are not always the same thing, and that sometimes communities will choose their own path when all other options have failed. As one elderly Skidmore resident put it shortly before his death, some people call it murder, we call it survival. The passage of time has done little to diminish the significance of the McElroy case in American legal and social history. In recent years, new generations of true crime enthusiasts and legal scholars have discovered the case, often drawing parallels between McElroy's reign of terror and modern instances of systematic intimidation and failure of the justice system. One particularly interesting aspect that has emerged in recent analyses is the role of social media and modern technology, or rather their absence, in keeping the town's secret. Many experts have speculated that such a conspiracy of silence would be nearly impossible today, with surveillance cameras, cell phones, and social media making it much harder to maintain complete secrecy around such a public event. The case has also gained renewed attention in discussions about rural decline in America. Skidmore's population has continued to dwindle, dropping to fewer than 300 residents in recent years. The town's main street, where McElroy met his end, is now largely deserted, with many buildings standing empty. Some residents argue that the McElroy case accelerated this decline, while others maintain that it was simply part of the broader pattern of rural exodus seen across America. The children and grandchildren of those present that day have inherited a complicated legacy. Many have grown up hearing whispered conversations that stop when they enter the room, aware that their parents and grandparents carry a secret they'll never share. Some have chosen to leave Skidmore, seeking to escape the shadow of that July morning, while others have remained, becoming part of the town's continuing wall of silence. One of McElroy's daughters, speaking anonymously to a journalist in 2018, offered a unique perspective. "I can't defend what my father did. He was a terrible man who hurt a lot of people. But watching an entire town maintain this secret for so long, I sometimes wonder if they've created another kind of terror, the terror of having to live with what they know." The case has also become relevant in modern discussions about community policing and justice reform. Advocates for reform often point to the McElroy case as an extreme example of what can happen when communities lose faith in the justice system's ability to protect them. As one criminal justice professor noted, the tragedy isn't just that McElroy was killed, it's that an entire community felt they had no other choice. The FBI officially closed its investigation in 2016, moving the case to its inactive files. By then, many of the key figures were deceased, and the prospects of ever bringing charges had become virtually non-existent. The closure marked the end of the longest-running active investigation of its kind in FBI history. In a final irony, Ken Rex McElroy's grave remains unmarked to this day. His body lies in a small cemetery near Skidmore, but no headstone marks the spot. It's as if even in death, the community's silence continues to envelop him. The story of Ken Rex McElroy and Skidmore, Missouri, stands as a unique chapter in American criminal justice history, a reminder that sometimes the most remarkable aspect of a crime is not the act itself, but the response to it. The town's unbroken silence, maintained for over 4 decades, speaks volumes about the complex relationships between justice, community, and survival. As one elderly Skidmore resident remarked recently, "People ask if we'll ever tell what really happened that day. The truth is, we already have. The silence itself is the story."